because we didn't have a breakout room last week. We're not going to have a breakout room this week, and so a lot of the things that were covered with David and Tom today will need to be summarised. This week we're going to look at classes, objects, and comments, and we also want to focus on the feedback form, and we'll post that on the chat a bit later. So also, just before I click out of this, I just want to say that we do have a new logo for the Women in Tech group. However, sadly, I haven't updated it yet, but look out for the new logo next week. So, Tom, without further to say, I'm going to hand over to you.
Okay, let me share my screen. Not much in the way of slides today, but okay, can everyone see that okay and hear me okay? Can people hear me?
Yep.
Okay, just wanted to make sure before I got started. Okay, so yes, hello everyone. So my name is Tom Hutchinson. I did, this is my second time here at the Coding Club. Before I did a session on strings. And today I'm going to be looking at object-oriented programming, which is what OOP stands for, and classes. And the two of those are very interlinked with each other. And yeah, just before I dive in, just a quick about my history with programming. So I didn't study programming or computer science at school or university. I learned actually just through like online resources, so codecademy.com and also YouTube as well. And yeah, so in terms of object-oriented programming and classes, I'm going to start off just with a kind of a definition for it, and then we're going to kind of over the next half an hour going to kind of work that out. So the definition for object-oriented programming is it's a style of programming in which we define classes which act like blueprints for creating objects. Now, that's a lot to take in. As I said, we'll kind of piece that apart through kind of a live demonstration. But the key bit I want you to take from that now is that it's a style of programming. Object-oriented programming is a different style of programming rather than just kind of like a different syntax or a different feature of Python. It's like a completely different style to the way you might have done something before. And so my own experience when I was taught object-oriented programming in classes was I found a lot of stuff about kind of how classes work or how you might be able to create a class, but there wasn't much discussion about like really what object-oriented programming is and why you might want to use classes. As I said, it's a bit different to say just like a function or like an if-else, and you just kind of need to learn how it works. I think someone's maybe not you. Well, that's me. I think got some nice music for.
Yep.
Yes, when I learned about this, I learned more about what is a class, and then object-oriented programming was more thought of as okay, object-oriented programming is just what we call using classes. So when we use classes, that is what object-oriented programming is. Whereas I think from my experience, it's actually taken me a long time to truly understand what, I'm just going to call it OOP from now on, so I don't have to say object-oriented programming every time. In order to learn what OOP is, I think it's more important to understand that and then to kind of understand how classes are used with that rather than just, okay, this is how you use a class. So what I'd like to do today is I'd like to take a kind of real life scenario problem and I'd like to solve it in two different ways to truly understand that object-oriented programming is not just like another bit of programming, but it's a very different way of solving problems. And so the best way to do that is to first, I'm going to try and solve this problem in kind of I'm just call it kind of the normal method. It's actually called procedural programming, but it's kind of the way that you would kind of naturally go to solve the problem. Or most people that are like first learning a programming language, they'll kind of go down this kind of route of solving it. And then I'm going to resolve the problem in an object-oriented way using classes. And hopefully then, by seeing the two different ways of solving the problem, hopefully you'll understand a bit more about kind of what object-oriented programming is, rather than just, okay, this is how you use a class. Hopefully that will make a bit more sense as we go through. So the problem I'm going to look at today is this scenario where you want to add a new user to your application. So this could be, you know, you could imagine you've got any kind of application. You could imagine you are like Facebook, for example, and you're trying to add a new user to an existing list of users. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to open up VS Code, and here I've got it's called procedural, for procedural programming, and this is one possible way that you could solve the problem. I'm going to explain how you might solve that problem in kind of the normal way of programming. And then once I've done that, I'm then going to say, okay, if we wanted to do this in an object-oriented programming style, how would we go about doing that? Okay, before I dive into this, has anyone got any questions about that? Just you can put in the chat, you don't have to say out loud. I'm sure Hanifa can let me know if anything comes in.
Yeah,
Okay.
sure. I'll keep an eye on that.
Thanks. Okay, so again, this is not at the moment the object-oriented programming approach. I'm first just trying to solve it in kind of let's say the normal way. It's called procedural programming, but in the normal way. And then we're going to look at kind of an OOP way of doing it. So here we've got this user pool here. This represents the users. So remember, we're trying to add a new user to the application. That's the scenario we're looking at now. So let's imagine that this user pool here is our list of existing users on our system, on our service. And that's just represented as a list. And inside that list is made up of separate dictionaries. So each of these represents a separate user on your program. And please stop me if any of this isn't making sense or we're not understanding exactly what we're trying to do here. But so inside our user pool, we've got a list of users, and those users are represented by dictionaries on dictionaries where we've got the username for this user and we've got the password. Okay, and then what we want to do is we want to be able to add a new user into this existing user pool. And what's important as well is we'd like it to be in alphabetical order as well. Because you might assume, okay, well, if it's a list, I know from one of these other sessions that if you've got a list, you can just do .append onto that list and you can just add something new onto the list. However, in this case, what we want to do is we want to add that user, but we want the user pool to always be in alphabetical order. Okay, so we've got Tom and Jerry here as our two pretend users, and we've got them in alphabetical order. And if we just did .append to our list, we'd end up always just adding this new user in. We'd always be adding a new user in here. But sometimes, say, you know, that wouldn't then always be in alphabetical order. So one way that we could approach this is we could create a function that you were looking at last week. And before I kind of start explaining how this function works, I wanted to look at this scenario for how we might solve the problem, because there's going to be some things here that are things that you've seen so far but may not remember particularly well, and there's a couple things here that I don't think you've seen yet. So there's like a break here and there's insert, and you don't need to worry about the fact that you haven't seen all this or you might not remember everything. What I'd like you to get from this section of the session is more just the general approach to how we're solving the problem. So not every single piece of syntax. You don't need to understand exactly what's happening all the time, just how we're trying to solve it. Okay, so we're creating a new function, and this new function is going to be, we're going to add a new user alphabetically. So we're going to add a new user into our user pool, and we're going to make sure it's added into the correct place. So if we add, later on, we're going to add a new user called Bugs Bunny. So we'd want Bugs Bunny to be added up here at the top, because the username begins with a B, so we want it to be in alphabetical order. So that's what we want this function to be able to do. Now, in order for this function to work, it needs to be given a few things. So firstly, it needs to be given the user pool that we're going to be adding this new user to, and it needs to be given the new user's username and password. And this is because if we're going to be adding into the user pool, we need the user pool, and we're going to be adding in the user's details into that user pool. And if you remember, these are called parameters. Okay, so these are things that were needed to use to do the function. Now, these two things here are two different styles of comments. So comments are just parts of your script that you don't want the computer to think is actually code. It's just a description for the person reading the code. So when it's just on one line, we can use this hash notation here. And this notation is for when you've got multiple lines of comments, then we want to use this triple quotes notation. And we generally use that, as I said, for when we've got multiple lines, but also when you're starting a function, you generally want to put this notation in just to explain what this function is going to do. So here you can see this function adds a new user to the existing user pool in the correct alphabetical order. And just for simplicity, I'm only doing it accurate to the first letter. So if as I said, we've got a new user called Bugs Bunny, then we want it, up here. Let's say we had a user called John, so the username was John, then I'm not particularly fast if it's above or below Jerry. Okay, just for simplicity, it's only going to work to the first letter. So we can break up this function, what it needs to do, into two different bits. So firstly, we need to find, well, where in the user pool are we going to add our new user? We need to find the correct position or index at which we're going to insert this new user into our user pool. And then once we found the correct position, we're then going to actually do the inserting of the new user at the appropriate position. Okay. Does anyone not understand what I've said there? Because I think I would like everyone to follow the core working of how it works. So if anyone doesn't get that, then if you could put in the chat.
So my question is, how is going to find out the alphabetic letter? Where is that in the code?
Sorry, what do you mean by where is the code?
No, which part of the code is pointing that to find out like alphabetic order in the code, I mean.
So that's what I'm going to.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah. So it was more, I just want to make sure that everyone is happy with the fact that there's kind of essentially two steps to this function. There's the first bit, which is finding out where to put it, the new user, like where to put it in the user pool. And that's where we'll say, that's where we will decide where to put it based on alphabetical order. So that's going to be in this section here under this comment. All this is going to be how to make sure it's done alphabetically.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Okay. So this is, and again, like there's plenty of different ways that you could go about solving this problem, but this was just kind of the way I thought about doing it. So I was thinking, what we want to do, in one way that we can make sure this is in alphabetical order, is we can go through our user pool one by one and say, okay, for this user, so say once we're going through one by one, we're taking the first user, member of the program that already exists. We're taking our first one, and then what we can do is we can check, okay, does our new user name, should that come before or after this pre-existing user? Now, if it comes, and obviously before and after, that's depending on alphabetical order. So say, for example, we're adding username Bugs Bunny here. What we want to do is we want to say, right, okay, is this new username, should it come before this user or should it come after? Well, in this case, it's in alphabetical order, so it should come before this user. And then what we want to do, if actually, say it was the username was Zelda, then we want to say, okay, no, it should come after this user. And then I want to take the next one. And what you can do is you can go through the existing user pool step by step until you find the user where the new user should go before. And in order to do that, we're going to need to compare the first letter of these usernames. So for this, so when we're taking this username, when we're taking this user, sorry, we want to compare the first letter of this username. So this is a capital J, and we want to compare that with the first letter of the new username. So if it was Bugs Bunny, that would be a capital B, and that's what we're going to compare to work out the order alphabetically. So when we're starting, but we also, when we're going through, as I said, if we check this one and then we check this one and it's, oh no, it still comes later, we need to keep a track of what position this is. For when we find, okay, we need to add it here, we need to have kept track of that position. So when we're starting, we haven't gone through any of these users yet to compare with our new username. When we've started, we're starting at position 0 or index 0. Okay, and we need to, as I said, in order to compare the existing user and the new user, we're doing that with the first letter of the username. So we can create a variable called new username first letter, and that is going to be the username we've given, and it's going to be the 0th kind of element in that string. Okay, so that's like, it's going to be given like a string. And this is, remember when I was talking about strings a few weeks ago, and when you're taking the 0th item, that means we're taking this first letter. And then we're going to start looping through our user pool. So for user and user pool, so when we're taking the first element in this loop, we need to take the first letter again in order to compare the first letters of the existing username and the new username. We need to take the first letters of both. So now we've got so in order to do that, we've got this user here, and we need to grab the username from that, and it's a dictionary, so you do that with this notation. And then we need to again take the first element, and that will give us Jerry, and then we need to take the first element here, which will give us that capital J. So now we're at this step here, and what we do is we say if the new username's first letter, so this is the username that we're looking to add, if the first letter comes before, that's what this before than, you can use that for strings actually as well as numbers. If that comes before the first letter here, then we know that that's the position that we want to insert our new user into. Because if this, say this was the new username's first letter was B, if it was like Bugs Bunny, then we know, okay, well, we know we want it to come before that element. Okay, so we want it to go in there. So we need some, and that index is 0. So what we need to do is we need to break out of that loop there. So right, I need to explain what breaking is here. So currently we're going through our user pool user by user. So if we're got this first one here, and if we decide, okay, we know what the position is, we don't want to keep looping through and checking against all these other ones because we've already found that it should go here. So in order to stop the program from, say it was going from here and then it would go here and then it would check, so there could be thousands of different users. In order to make sure it doesn't just keep looking through each of those different users, what we can do is we can say break, and what that will do is it will take us out of that looping process and it will just put us essentially at the next line outside of the for loop. So in the case where we've got Bugs Bunny, what's happening is index, or the position, starts at 0. And we find the first letter of the new username, which is capital B, and we find the first letter of the existing one. And as we're looping, we're just on the first one at the moment. That's a capital J. And because the new username, the capital B, comes before the existing one, the capital J, we can just keep this position as 0, because 0, the 0th position is where we want to add our new user. And if it isn't, and the new username actually comes after the existing user that we're looking at, then we want to continue our loop because we need to check then against the later entries of the user pool. But we need to increase our position or our index by 1 because we're now at the next position. Okay. Now, I've got a feeling that that may have been quite a lot of information, and I may not have explained that in the best way. But I hope that, at least for some people, they did follow that or can kind of follow the code itself rather than my explanation. But for the people that didn't or couldn't quite follow all of that, I don't want you to kind of think, oh, well, I'm just not going to get this. Again, I haven't actually moved on to object-oriented programming yet. This is just one way you could solve this problem. So don't worry too much if you didn't understand kind of every line I went through there. I just want you to understand generally what we are trying to do here. Yeah, we're trying to find the position according to the alphabet where we should insert our new user. And once we're out of this loop, we've got our index, which is the position at which we should insert our new user. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to actually insert the new user at the appropriate position which we found in the user pool. So in order to create our new user, remember each user is represented by a dictionary. So first we need to actually create that dictionary from the username and password we've been given. So new user here, this is how you define that. So we're creating a new variable called new user, and it's got the username and password that we've passed in there. And then we're going to use this notation here, dot insert, to actually add the new user at the correct position or index, as it's called. Okay, so the way we do that is we're taking user pool, which is our list of users. And we're going to insert the new user that we've just defined here, which just has the username and password that we've fed into it. And we're going to add it in at the index that we've calculated here. And that was decided upon just by alphabetical order. Okay, and to finish off, we now can call this function and we can give it the user pool that we want to update, and we can give it the username, a new username and a new password. So as I said, let's create a new username called Bugs Bunny with the password BunnyPass. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to print out the final result of what that user pool looks like once we've added in our new user. Okay, with VS Code, what's quite useful is you can just press this kind of run button here, and we can see our new user pool has updated with Bugs Bunny and BunnyPass. Our new user here has been added in the correct position. However, if I wanted to instead, let's see what happens if we try and add a new user called Zelda. Pass, and this should be added at the bottom of our user pool because alphabetically by username, that's where it's going to be added. And let's just check that also happens. Yeah, we've got our Bugs Bunny, and this time we've also got Zelda here with the password ZeldaPass at the end. Okay, so I appreciate that was a lot of information. Does anyone have any questions about, I understand there may be some confusion about the specific syntax, but I don't want to get into that too much because I do want to speak mostly about object-oriented programming. But is there anything there about the general approach, you know, the fact we've created a function and then we're calling that function to add our new user? Is anyone confused about that kind of overall approach to solving the problem?
Well, in general, it's good, but it would be better like if we can break up and then run the code and see what's going to happen through different stages. Is that possible, or it will take a lot of time?
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah.
Because I think
it's a lot easier to take in all at once.
In one go. Another thing for me to understand that like we are just adding this username and password. I could understand like in the future could be used like input to bring like we have 10, 20 username and then being added to this program and at the end of the day will be like sorted out. Is that what like for one of the application to be used?
So you mean like, could it be possible to add multiple users and then kind of do the alphabetical sorting at the end rather than each time you add the user?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, so again, that's, as I was saying, that is one way we could also solve the problem. So there's lots of ways to solve any problem in programming. It's not, there's not just kind of one way of doing it. I was just trying to think of when I was just adding one user. But yeah, if you were doing this practically and you were, say, running Facebook and you wanted to do this in a more kind of like streamlined way, then you could do it like that as well. But yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, if I was going to be explaining this again, I would break it up next time because I appreciate that was, I think when I was writing it out, I was thinking, I can kind of talk through it, but I appreciate it probably would be easier to kind of do it a bit kind of piece by piece. But just in the thing of time, I feel like we should probably move on to kind of object-oriented programming in classes, because I know I've got till past. Is that okay? Or?
Yeah.
It's fine. Tom, thanks for the overview, but I ran the same code on my machine and it came up with a error. Is it all right if I share my screen?
Yeah, go on.
Cool. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, if possible, you can make that full screen.
Sure. Right. So, as was mentioned in the problem, first generated this user pool and then made a definition, a function, and then index equals to 0, and then first letter of the new user as user name, 0, and then a loop for user in user pool.
The only thing I think you haven't got a what's it called, underscore between your R and P in user pool on line 87. So on line 87, you've got user pool one word, but in everywhere else you've got an underscore. Right. Yeah, I think that should
fix things. Oh yes, it is there.
Oh.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
No worries. Okay, I think it's probably worth moving on to kind of how we might solve this problem in a object-oriented programming sense. Apologies, yeah, again, if that was a bit too much all in one chunk. I will take that on board. Okay, so before we do that, let's think about what could be the potential issues with using. Oh wait, I need to actually share my screen. Okay. Cool. So before we talk about object-oriented programming, we need to think about what are potential issues with using this kind of approach to solving this problem. So the issue can be is if you're just kind of adding functions kind of as and when you need them, or you've got quite a lot of information here inside a single function. When you've got that kind of setup, it can be quite difficult to read exactly what's going on. Because say you've got like 1,000 different functions and they all have different parameters, and it's difficult to understand exactly how those functions are calling other functions because it's not really organized in any particular way. It's just kind of as and when you need a function, you're creating it and you're putting in lots of information in each function. And what can happen is,
sorry to interrupt. I've just wanted to read out a comment. Denise was saying something about potentially if it's possible to post the code into the chat so it can try it later on. I don't know how feasible that is.
Yeah, I think what I can do is I can, you don't have a Teams, no, on the chat you've got a files, I believe. There's a files section. There'll be a way, yeah. I'll definitely, okay. I can share the code at the end. That'll be fine.
Okay, thank you.
No worries. But yeah, when you're just kind of creating functions as and when you want, it's kind of okay when you've got a small script like this. You know, this isn't particularly large, but if you're running a large program that may have 10 different functions, it can be quite confusing to know exactly how things fit together, and you might make a change in this function and it might impact another function because you've called it in that other function, but it's difficult to know exactly how it all fits together. And it then becomes quite difficult if things aren't working. It's difficult to know why is this thing not working or why is that thing not working, because you've just kind of defined your functions as and when you wanted them. And yeah, and so what would be quite useful is if we could organize our code in a particular way. And the way that code tends to be, is organized in object-oriented programming is kind of is in the name, is by objects or by classes of objects. And what I mean by that is we can try and think about how could we solve this problem, or like what objects, what types of things are we using in this problem. So I can think of two separate things that we looked at in this problem. So firstly, there was a user pool, and then there was also users. And essentially this problem can be broken down into how these two types of things interact. So how do user pools and users interact? And that's the first step that you need to understand when you are looking at object-oriented programming. It's a way of solving problems by understanding kind of the objects that are used in that problem. So let's start by thinking about what the user object is like. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a class of objects that's called users. There's a class of objects, that will be users. So the way we do that, first off, we say, okay, this here is creating this type of user object. Then we need to think about what are the features of the user object. So what are the things that's important about a user? So two things that I can think about is, one, every user has a username, and secondly, every user also has a password. And those are the two what we can call properties of any user type object. Okay, so what we need to do is we need to say whenever we're creating a new user, okay, and that the way we say that is we put line init, and this means whenever we initialize, this is what the init stands for, whenever we initialize a new user object, I'll explain what the self is in a moment. Whenever we create this new object, we also need to create with it, it's going to have a username and it's going to have a password. And what we do is we need to define in here that these are going to be the two properties that will be part of the user object. And so what does that mean in practicality? I can get rid of these two now. This means that whenever we create a new user object, we need to give it a username and a password. So let's say we want to create, an object called Jerry. So to create a new user object, what we do is we use our user, from here, and we need to pass in a username that we want this user to have, and also a password that we want it to have. So the user that we want it to have, well, we want it to be Jerry with a capital J, and let's give it Jerry pass as well for the password. Okay, and now if we want to access, this is what's going to explain this self business here. If we want to access, so we've got our Jerry object. When we've got that and say we want to access, okay, what is the username for the Jerry object? What we can do is we can print out Jerry, and we've defined here that the username is going to be what that thing is, dot username. So if we do Jerry.username and we run this, we see that we get Jerry. Okay, so this is a way of defining the properties of that type of object. So for the user object, it's always going to have a username and it's always going to have a password. And this is how we're now going to build out our program based around objects. Okay, is there any questions about this here? Oh, sorry, and the self. The reason why we've got this strange self thing here is because this self is essentially a placeholder for the object. So we've got the Jerry object here. So if we want to find the username for that object, the Jerry object, we need to, instead of putting self, we're defining self.username, but instead of that, it's going to be that object.username. So Jerry.username. And whenever we define a function inside our class, we always need to include this self here. Okay, too much time, so I need to move on. Okay, so that's fine for our user. So that's everything that goes into so every user object is going to have a username and password. That's fine. Now, the second type of object that I was talking about was a user pool. So let's create a new class called user pool. And we use this notation where we're using, it's called camel case, where it's where we're using capitals and it's all together in one word. It's only classes where we use that notation. Normally, I think people are probably aware we use kind of this kind of thing, where it's underscores and it's all lowercase. But for classes, for some reason, that's how we like to do it. Okay, so create our new class called user pool. So when it comes to saying, well, what features do we know that we're always going to have for our user pool? Well, we know that the user pool is always, it's going to start off anyway as an empty list, yeah, because it's going to be a list, and then we're going to add new users to that list. There's not really any other features of a user pool. A user pool is just the user pool, and it's got its users, but it's not like a user has kind of a username and a password, whereas the user pool is just the user pool itself, which is just a list. So we can define it as a list. And then inside the user pool, we can also then talk about the way that you might add to that user pool. So attached to the idea of what the user pool is how you can add new users to that user pool. And so this is a way of organizing the code by the object. So in order so when you're creating a new function, which is add new user to user pool, that's going to sit inside the class user pool. So we can create that here, which is that add new user alphabetically, which is going to be pretty much the same as what we had before, but it's about how we organize that code. And of course, we need to actually put that self in there, and we can put new user in here. Okay, and then I'm gonna drag this over here just so we can see them side by side, because much of this is going to be the same. Okay, so again, this is a function which adds a new user to the existing user pool. And yeah, well, we can copy and paste this, but we are going to need to change a couple of things when we do so. Okay, so what we need to do, as we can see these, I'm going to drag this across now, so we're looking at just this. Now, we haven't said what the user, we haven't actually defined what the username is here. So the username is going to be part of the new user, which is itself, remember, we're now doing this based around the objects. So it's going to be an object of the class user. So if we want to get the username from our user object, remember we've got this self.username. What we had before was that, I can't remember what the name, but we did the .username. So instead of username, we need to actually define what that username is. So it's our new user that we're adding, but because it's a new user object, we need to do new user dot username. And we're going to need here, instead of user pool, remember it's self.userpool. Okay, and because this is still in here, it is still going to be self.userpool rather than the name of the object.userpool, because this is still general. And where else do we need to update? Okay, so in here again, we've got username, but instead of username, we need to actually say, well, it's going to be the new user dot username, because we're taking from the new user type object. New user dot password, and again, this is going to be self dot userpool. Okay, and this is what, so now we've got our two different types of objects. So it's a different way of organizing your code. So we've got a user object, we've got a user pool object, and inside the user pool object, it explains how to add new users to the user pool, which is this variable that we've defined here. Okay, so if we want to then create a user pool, we can create, let's call it the user pool, and this is going to be a new instance of the user pool object. The way that we create a new instance of an object is we do this. Okay, so we take our class, and then we can almost like a function, we put the brackets there, and it's inside here that you put the information that goes inside your init. So these here, you don't need to put self, but you need to put the other ones. But because for the user pool, we don't have any extra parameters, we don't need to put anything inside here. Now let's start. So now we've got our user pool. And if we want to actually check, we can do print user pool. But remember, we need to actually then do the dot user pool to get our list. So user pool dot user pool. And we can run that. And we can see we've got our empty user pool ready. So what we can do now is we can actually start adding new users to this user pool. So first, let's create a new user. So let's create our Jerry. So Jerry is going to be an instance of the user class. So we need to do this. And we actually need to give the parameters. So VS Code's quite clever because I've already said what goes in here. It's saying I need to put a username in for this object. So we're going to call Jerry Jerry. And then I need to put a password in. So I'm going to give, and I'm going to give capital J. Okay. And what other users do we want to give? Let's also give Tom, because it's going to be Tom and Jerry. Tom pass, and let's also go for Bugs Bunny. Okay, so these are the three users that we've created. And you can see it's quite easy to create these new users because we've got this class here of user, which acts as like a blueprint for when you want to create a new user. You just use the class. Now we want to actually add these new users. We actually want to add these new users into our user pool that we've created here. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to take our user pool object, which we have defined here. We're going to take that, and then we're going to apply the method, okay, which is like the function that belongs to the class. We're going to apply that method to our user pool. And in here, remember that it's telling us we need to add in the new user that we've created. Yeah, because that's what's needed for that. That's the parameter needed for that function. So let's add Jerry in. And then let's see what the user pool looks like. I understand it's half past, so I'm going to go through this last bit. Okay, let's see what it looks like now. We can see it's successfully adding Jerry in. And let's do the same, but this time let's add Jerry, Tom, and Bugs. And then we can just check that it does actually add in the correct order. So there we go. We've got Bugs first, then we've got Jerry, then we've got Tom. Okay, so we've used essentially the same code. It's more about how we've organized that code. Okay, so object-oriented programming, as it sounds, it's oriented around separate objects that you can then manipulate to solve your problems. And I think the main reason why you'd want to use that is because it's kind of almost like how you would solve problems in the real world, is you have ideas of different objects and how they fit with each other. And it's just a way of bringing that to programming. So I'm going to stop there. I'm not going to take up any more of your time. Thank you very much for listening. Obviously it's half past now, but if anyone does have questions, feel free to just send me a message and I will answer them happily.
Wonderful. That was a great session.